manufacturing due for a resurgence? I'm speaking today with Shay Scott. He is Executive Director of the Global Supply Chain Institute and Professor in the Department of Marketing and Supply Chain Management at the University of Tennessee. Hello, Shay. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
And thanks for spending time with me here today. So let's start with the Biden administration's Buy American policies. What impact do you think that might have on manufacturers and their decision whether to reshore or not reshore production to this country?
Well, first, I think it does bring needed attention to this issue of our supply chain configurations. For a long time, we have not been able to really get a certain interest from political leaders in the complexity and the nature of supply chains. And so I think this Buy American Act does shine the spotlight in that direction. What impact it will have, I think that is going to vary quite widely depending on the type of product, the type of manufacturer. It's probably not going to make a tremendous difference because there's such a multitude of issues that drive those supply chain configuration decisions. But where they're balanced, maybe it'll tip the scales a little bit, or at least cause corporate boards to consider something they haven't before.
I guess we shouldn't assume anything. Is there an actual need for a resurgence of American manufacturing, in your opinion?
Great question. I do think that it is well past time for companies to really sit down and probably take a more balanced look at how their supply chains are configured. And when I say configured, I mean where those nodes of sourcing, of manufacturing, of distribution are. All too often, companies take a copycat approach to the way they configure their supply chains, or they're chasing low-cost manufacturing because it looks good in an oversimplified business case. And I think as we've seen through the pandemic, as we've seen through the trade wars that predated the pandemic, oftentimes the situation is quite more complicated or nuanced, and it merits a close look at not only whether our solution that emerged over years still fits, but also how robust that is, to the turbulence that we're seeing across a number of areas.
What are some of the economic and geopolitical factors that might cause manufacturers to consider reshoring?
Sure. So again, it's a little difficult to generalize across the board. Certainly in some industries, we have tariffs that have come in that are driving substantial costs. But even in many of those industries, it hasn't caused a reconfiguration. It's just caused the supply chain to take on additional cost. Now, as you begin to up the unsettled nature of relationships, and maybe it escalates past a spat of words into real issues between nations, then all of a sudden, what was a workable supply chain, could become unworkable overnight. And so those types of geopolitical issues are really at the forefront now. And I think we have probably been lulled a bit over the past 20 years into a greater sense of security and normalcy than we really ever had. But now we see that a lot of those things that we assumed as being fixed or constants aren't indeed. And so all of a sudden, where we could source from a country, where we could source at a reliable cost with a reliable transit time, those maybe aren't valid assumptions these days. Yeah. And so it's a new world for us.
Now, I wonder if the 1-2 punch of the pandemic, followed by the severe congestion that we are seeing in the supply chain, especially at the West Coast ports, might cause a rethink, or at least be factors in that process.
Absolutely. And I think we've seen the situation progressively worsen over the case of the pandemic. We look back, 12 to 18 months ago, and we were seeing the initial demand shocks and supply shocks, and we were talking about how difficult that it was. But now we fast forward to the present, and we've really not faced the level of difficulty and complexity that we're seeing because of the snowball effect. Just like you said, it started with the trade wars. Certainly the bilateral issues between China and the U.S., and then the pandemic and the Delta variant, and now the congestion, and the whole system is just thrown off balance. And frankly, it looks like for many areas, it's going to be off balance probably for months to come.
Let's say that manufacturers want to make a sincere effort to bring manufacturing back to the United States for whatever reason. What obstacles might stand in their way?
Yes. So, I think first and foremost, a company has to really put together a solid case looking end to end at their supply chain and begin to look at what benefits does an increased level of responsiveness to customers? What benefits does guarding against risk actually provide to your company? But then even then, when we look at these configuration decisions, a lot of times they require immense amount of capital. Labor. And so we already, almost everyone, unless you're living under a rock, has experienced labor shortages. Whether it's just restaurants with reduced hours, or really whether we're talking about hourly worker skills, professional workers. There's just labor shortages that abound across all industries. So the idea of coming back into this market is easier said than done.
Yeah, it used to be, well, American workers are too expensive. Now it's like we can't get American workers, so we can't even bring them in to have the discussion about how much to pay them because they don't want to come to work for us.
Yeah, exactly. And it is that new reality, whether it's the labor or you mentioned congestion and transportation shortages. I was just at a major East Coast port last week for a few days and talking with the leadership there. And again, it's capacity issues. Even if you pay 5 times what you were paying 12 months ago, in many cases, customers are being turned away just out of lack of capacity, or even if they make it a part of the way in the journey, then there's some failure, right? Maybe it's intermodal, it's drayage, it's conditions at a port, whether it's port of origin or port of destination. And so you look at those types of things coupled with labor. The quote unquote simple things aren't simple anymore.
Yeah, if they ever were. So
that's true. Yeah, I think it was a fallacy that they were.
Yeah, supply chains being what they are. Are you seeing any meaningful moves in this direction at this point, or is it still too early days in terms of it being an actual trend?
Yeah, so I think we're still in the early days. We are still seeing a substantially higher amount of talk than action. And again, this does widely vary across industry, where you have capital requirements, those types of things happen over years. But I do think that the situation will continue to have an impact as companies make these decisions, as they need to bring a new facility online in order to add capacity, as they need to reconfigure a sourcing base. Issues of risk and reliability and robustness will have more of a feature, because now we can go talk about it in boardrooms. That's been one of the issues to date, is when a supply chain leader wanted to sell something that wasn't a low-cost solution, they needed to go in and make a case. And oftentimes corporate leadership was like, well, that's your job as a supply chain executive to keep all those bad things from happening. I want the low-cost solution, and I want it to be robust to risk. And I think if we've learned anything, those that work outside the field in corporate leadership positions have realized that everything is not within our control. There are environmental risk factors that are out there that we need to, devise a strategy to meet.
Well, sometimes it takes a lot to teach lessons to global businesses. They move pretty slowly, but if anything's going to do it, it's the events of the last year and a half. So we will see. In the meantime, though, Shay Scott at the University of Tennessee, thank you very much for helping us to parse this very complex issue and understand what some of the factors are that may or may not determine a resurgence or a return of American manufacturing. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.